Well, hello everyone. I think we've given people time to get into the Zoom room now at 5 here in Oxford. Welcome to this talk, which is the final talk of the term in Worcester College's online academic lecture series. I need to note first of all that the lecture is being recorded, so please do be aware of that. My name is Mark Bainbridge, and I'm the fellow librarian here at Worcester. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Meredith Cutrer, who's a DPhil student here in the Faculty of History at Oxford, and also the first holder of the Michael Biggs Scholarship in memory of James Campbell at Worcester College. Meredith is a specialist in the late antique and early medieval periods of Britain, Ireland, and Egypt, with a particular focus on church history. She has participated in multiple archaeological digs at sites in Uzbekistan, Ireland, Wales, Spain, and Cornwall. And her dissertation explores the church's use of punitive exile in Britain and Ireland from the 5th to the 9th centuries. Additionally, she's also under contract with the Translated Texts for Historians series, co-authoring a book which will provide a translation and study of 10 Irish saints' lives from the medieval period. Tonight, Meredith is going to talk to us about Egypt and the Insular High Crosses, exploring the Egyptian influence on some of the most iconic and recognizable pieces of art from medieval Britain and Ireland. There will be time for questions at the end, so if you have any, please put them in the chat and I'll read them out for Meredith. Meredith, welcome. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to speak this evening. It's a real pleasure to present tonight on a topic that I hope help us appreciate to a greater degree the rich heritage of Britain and Ireland's early medieval stone sculptures and the vibrant intellectual culture which produced them. Now, I just want to know, because I know there's a few specialists in the audience and the participants list, that this is meant for more of a general audience, because it was impressed upon me when I was in Kells last time that many people who interact with these crosses on a regular basis don't really have a real understanding of what these crosses represent. So it's my task tonight really to try to show just a little bit of what these crosses offer in terms of cultural heritage so that hopefully we can enjoy them even more. So few pieces of art are associated with Britain and Ireland and are more widely recognizable than the magnificent medieval stone crosses. It is obvious to even a casual observer that the medieval communities who made them devoted considerable resources in terms of time and money to create and preserve them. The medieval community's investment in these crosses was great. So it's worth taking a step back and asking ourselves as 21st century observers of these crosses to understand some of what these crosses must have meant to the communities who invested that time and the resources to erect them. While many people are able to recognize that these crosses must have played an important part of the visual culture of medieval Britain and Ireland's religious communities, very few outside of the academy have had the opportunity to study them in any depth. Because of this, we run the risk of letting this significant piece of British and Irish cultural heritage be confined to the realm of academia, instead of appreciating the crosses as public artworks with a significant part of our cultural heritage that can be enjoyed and appreciated by all. While I don't have the time to provide the full introduction to these stone crosses, I do want to spend our time together this evening giving you an overview of some of the aspects of the scholarly conversation surrounding the ways that Egypt may have had an influence on these crosses. And that will also, I think, give us a real insight into the rich intellectual culture of the medieval communities who made them. Many may be surprised to find that a number of British and Irish stone monuments from the medieval period have been influenced by Egypt. When art historians talk about Egyptian influence, they typically mean one of two things. First, there is Egyptian influence that can be broadly considered pharaonic, or the art that comes from what might come to mind when we think of the non-Christian ancient Egyptian culture. Two famous examples, which I provide on the slide here. And the other category of Egyptian influence is that of the Coptic Christians from late antique Egypt. One such potential area of Coptic influence is in the shape of the high crosses themselves. The shape of the insular ring crosses has long been a source of scholarly discussion, with many art historians once believing that these crosses had their origin in Roman models. This started to change in 1984 when art historian Walter Horn happened to visit the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and came upon the textile that we see on the far left of this slide, which was the closest model to the shape of the iconic ring crosses found in Britain and Ireland that we have to date. So it is the very shape of the cross, including its distinctive ring, that may have originated in the Egyptian Coptic Church of late antiquity. But there are other undeniable Coptic influences that we are going to discuss at greater length this evening that will give us a fascinating glimpse into some key aspects of early insular Christian communities who created them and created these monuments. For now, I simply wanted to provide some examples of Coptic art to provide some context for our later discussion. I want to turn now to the high crosses themselves. We are going to start in one of Ireland's most famous early medieval monastic sites called Monaster Boyce, which is found on the east coast of Ireland as indicated on the map here. The potential influence of Pharaonic Egypt and the definite influence of Coptic Egypt is conveniently represented on one of Ireland's most famous crosses called Meredith's Cross. This cross gets its name from an inscription in Old Irish on the base of the cross, which is seen on the picture in the middle of the slide here. This inscription says, "A prayer from Meredith, who had this cross erected." The cross is one of three surviving high crosses at Monaster Boyce. I include pictures on this slide of the three medieval crosses that still remain from the medieval period. Seen here on the picture on the far right is Meredith's cross, which dates to the 9th or the 10th century and is one of the most spectacular examples of Irish stonework we still have today. It's Meredith's cross that I want to look at more closely first, to give you an overview of some of the discussion around Pharaonic influence on Egyptian high crosses in particular. Among the rich imagery on the north and the east faces of Meredith's cross are two scenes in prominent positions that I want to consider now. The scene on the left is most certainly Egyptian in its origin, deriving from a story of two famous Coptic Egyptian saints. And the scene on the right may derive from ancient Egyptian art, from the art of the time of the pharaohs. Pharaonic influence in medieval Irish art may sound outlandish at first, as ancient Egypt and medieval Ireland are quite distant from each other in time and space. But it may not be as far-fetched as we might imagine. For instance, Professor John Carey at the University College Cork has done a careful study of a medieval Irish text called the Evernutum, the beginning of which is found in the manuscript from the Book of Lismore on the right. The Evernutum was probably written in the 9th century, which is about the same time as Meredith's cross, which we were just looking at, was erected. Professor Carey argues that a striking scene in the 9th century Evernutum, which gives an account of the course of the sun from the time when the sun sets to the time when it rises again, ultimately derives from a funerary text from the Egyptian New Kingdom called the Imduit, a fragment of which we can see here on the left. And the oldest surviving copy of the Imduit, which is engraved on the walls of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose I, who died in 1493 BC, whose bust at the British Museum is seen on the right. Now, on the left, we have a well-preserved version of the Imduit story from the tomb of the pharaoh Thutmose III. Now, Professor Carey is not the only scholar who has argued for Egyptian motifs in medieval Irish literature. And so it's not entirely implausible that visual images deriving from Pharaonic Egypt might also have made their way to medieval Ireland. Turning back to Meredith's cross, the focal point of the east face is a large scene in the center of the cross representing the Last Judgment. This is a key moment in Christian eschatology, which is the study of end times beliefs, where Jesus has come for a second time to earth, this time as judge to consign souls to either heaven or hell for all eternity. Here we see an imposing figure of Christ with his hands at his chest holding a cross and a staff in a V-shaped pattern. And below Christ, we see the Archangel Michael in front of scales, weighing the souls of the deceased to determine whether they will spend eternity in paradise or in hell. As far as the evidence we have remaining today can tell us, this weighing of the souls scene, adapted for a Christian context, is first seen in Ireland. However, the imagery of using scales in the afterlife to determine a dead person's eternal fate has a long tradition in ancient Egypt. To give a frame of reference for the ways in which the Last Judgment scenes have been depicted in Christian art, I've chosen a few medieval examples to highlight some unique aspects of what we see on Meredith's cross that have striking parallels with ancient Egypt. As we look through these images, I want you to pay special attention to Jesus, specifically the position of Jesus's arms and what he's holding in his hands, because these are going to be key pieces of the argument for some art historians who propose that the Last Judgment scene on Meredith's cross may have been influenced by pharaonic Egyptian motifs. The folios displayed here, dated to the 10th century and contemporary with Meredith's cross, are from one of the earliest surviving Spanish manuscripts and displays a colorful Last Judgment scene. The differences between the scene on Meredith's cross and this contemporary manuscript are many. We can see Christ seated in heaven in a mandorla, with one arm holding a book and the other making a sign. Below Christ, we see seated figures blessing the saved souls, whereas on the right, we see souls of those condemned to hell in various stages of their condemnation. We do not see any scales or weighing of souls like we see on Meredith's cross. And Christ's position, as well as his hands and the items he's holding, are altogether different. The Last Judgment was a popular motif in Romanesque and Gothic sculpture, particularly with the approach of the year 1000, when the apocalypse was on people's mind. I've provided here a famous example, sculpted approximately 200 to 300 years later than Meredith's cross, of a gorgeous Last Judgment scene on the Cathedral of Conques tympanum, which is a lunette. The tympanum is a lunette or a semicircular shaped part of the church's facade, usually just above the entrance to a church. This image was put in a prominent position as churchgoers entered in order to provide them a sober reminder of the high stakes of being negligent with their souls. On this tympanum at Conques, I have drawn a yellow square around the large figure of Christ, who sits empty-handed, with palms facing the viewer, one hand raised in a welcoming gesture to those who are saved, while the other hand points downward, drawing the viewer's attention to the frenetic scenes of hell that await evildoers. Right now, the church at Conques has a light installation that projects color onto the tympanum, which makes the composition much more readable. I include here this colored version of the tympanum to make the weighing of the souls underneath Jesus' feet easier to see. We can see the Archangel Michael on the left staring intently at a devil who looks defiantly back at him. The devil puts his finger on the scale to try to tip the balance in favor of sending the soul to hell. But despite the devil's efforts, it seems that the good still outweighs the sinner's bad in balances. This motif of weighing the souls, as mentioned, is first seen, as far as we can tell, in Western Christian context in Ireland. But as a number of medieval art historians have noted, this is a motif that has deep roots in ancient Egypt. The next example is from the Cathedral of Autun, dated to a century or two after Meredith's cross. The tympanum over the central portal of the west facade was sculpted by Giselbertus, and as art historian Marilyn Stokestad comments, bears some resemblance to the illustrations in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, just like Meredith's cross. However, Jesus once again looks quite different than what we see on Meredith's cross, with his arms outstretched and his palms facing the viewer. On the right, in the red box, we see the Archangel Michael overseeing the weighing of the souls. The souls are weighed on a scale, while a devil tries to once again tip the balance in favor of damning the soul who is being weighed. Now, having looked briefly at a few of the most famous Last Judgment scenes in medieval art for the sake of comparison, we turn our attention back to Ireland, where we see the Last Judgment scene as the lavish centerpiece on Meredith's cross. I only have time to give a few highlights of some points of comparison drawn out by Kees Wielenturf's article, which I cite at the top of this slide here, where he argues for the influence of pharaonic images of Osiris and scenes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead on the high crosses of medieval Ireland. Now, it's important to note that Wielenturf is not the first by any stretch of the imagination to argue for such things. We see Francois Henry, Arthur Kingsley Porter as well, arguing for potential pharaonic influence and Osiris imagery on the high crosses. Now, Wielenturf's argument rests on a few significant points of similarity between the scene and those found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The first point of similarity is found in Jesus' pose. The second is the weighing of the souls beneath Jesus' feet. And the third is the Judgment Day theme of the scene as a whole. I will look at each one briefly in turn. Jesus' pose with his hands at his chest, clutching a cross and a staff or scepter, or of some sort, that form of V shape, is a distinctive pose that has a long precedent in pharaonic Egyptian art. Now, this pose is called the Osiris pose, and it is found elsewhere in contemporary Insular art as well. We can see two famous examples here. Now, since many of us are from Worcester, sometime I couldn't resist including the Alfred Jewel in this, which is just down the street from Worcester at the Ashmolean Museum. And on the right, we also have the portrait page of the evangelist Luke from the Lichfield Gospels. Both figures hold their staffs in a V shape before their chest, like we see with Jesus on Meredith's cross. This pose is associated with either power or divinity, or both. This same Osiris pose is also found on other Irish high crosses. One of Ireland's most famous crosses, the Tower Cross at Kells, features a large image of Jesus in the center of its west face, where Jesus is shown either in majesty in heaven or on Judgment Day. It's not entirely clear. Other crosses in Ireland, including crosses at Durrow and Clonmacnoise, feature Christ shown in the Osiris pose as well. When it comes to Meredith's cross, and potentially the cross here at Kells, if indeed this is a representation of Christ on Judgment Day, then we have an association on these crosses between Osiris' pose and the end-time beliefs centered on the final judgment of souls. This association between the Osiris pose and the end times beliefs this association between Osiris' pose on Meredith's cross, for instance, and the judgment of souls is one of the key arguments that some art historians use to propose that the scene's imagery derives at least in part from pharaonic Egypt. Now, pharaonic Egypt is the Egypt of the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Egypt of the Sphinx, and the Egypt of the enchanting mythological stories of gods like the jackal-headed Anubis or the great god Osiris, the powerful deity of the afterlife, both of whom are pictured here in this papyrus from a famous copy of the Book of the Dead now housed in the British Museum. The Book of the Dead is a funerary text which contains a selection of spells intended to help a deceased person navigate through the Last Judgment and win everlasting life. Many variants of the Book of the Dead exist, and these texts were often illustrated as we see here. The scene pictured on the slide shows a key event that an Egyptian pharaoh's scribe named Ani, who had recently died, went through upon his death. He is having his heart weighed to determine if he led a good enough life to enter paradise. Here we see the jackal-headed god of the dead named Anubis weighing Ani's heart. The Egyptians believed that the heart contained all the good and bad deeds of a person's life. When people died, their hearts were weighed on a scale against the feather of the god Mot, which is what we see in this scene. Anubis oversees this process, and if a person were bad, the heart would be eaten by Ammit. usually represented with the head of a crocodile, who can be found at the bottom right of the slide. If the person led a good life, the heart and the feather would be perfectly balanced, and the person would be considered worthy to spend their afterlife in paradise with Osiris, who's pictured in the top right, who is the Egyptian god of the afterlife. Osiris is shown in this painting with his hands together in fist, clutching his crook and flail, which were associated both with Osiris, the god, and with the power of the pharaohs, as represented in this famous canopic coffin of Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, just to the left of Osiris. Osiris's pose should look familiar to us now as the same distinctive pose we saw on the Irish crosses we looked at just a moment ago. These representations of Osiris were commonplace in Egypt, and with the movement of people and goods throughout the multi-ethnic Roman Empire, of which Egypt, Gaul, and Britain were part, it should not be a surprise then that in the region of modern-day France that is closest to the English Channel, we have at least 7 Osiris figurines that have been found to date on archaeological digs. A few Osiris figurines have also been found in Britain, but it's not entirely clear from the archaeological context whether they date to an early period or whether they came later. On this slide, I've included 2 more images from Egyptian papyri showing Osiris with his V-shaped hand position, overseeing the weighing of the souls and a type of Judgment Day scene. And another one. This one, housed at the British Museum, shows once again Osiris as judge, supervising the weighing of the deceased individual's souls, which hang in the balance quite literally. So the distinctive Osiris pose associated with kingship and divinity in ancient Egypt is used with Jesus several times on Irish high crosses when he is represented as the overseer of the Day of Judgment, in a role similar to Osiris in the Book of the Dead images from ancient Egypt. This is especially interesting when we consider the inclusion of Meredith's cross of the souls being weighed beneath Jesus's feet, which, just as we see the hearts being weighed on the scales in the Book of the Dead scenes that Osiris supervises. Now, the possible influence, and I do say possible influence, of Egyptian motifs that come from Pharaonic Egypt remain a topic for academic debate, and probably will continue to be discussed for a long time yet. But where Egyptian influence is absolutely undeniable on medieval stone sculptures is on the inclusion of 2 Egyptian Coptic monks in some of the earliest stone crosses and carved slabs from Britain and Ireland. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Meredith's cross has evidence of both Pharaonic and Coptic influence. At the very top of the cross's north face, on the left side of the slide here, there is an undeniable representation of 2 Egyptian saints. Now, above the Last Judgment on the right side of the slide, there have been a lot of people identify the scene here, this panel here that's surrounded in the yellow square, as potentially Paul and Antony. I think there's good reason to believe it is not Paul and Antony, but I just leave it up here to say that there are some people, including a lot of popular literature, that does identify it as Paul and Antony. But on the left, we certainly see the 2 saints from Egypt on Meredith's cross. Now, in this scene, we have 2 non-biblical late antique saints seen on a cross comprised overwhelmingly otherwise of biblical scenes. This scene is a depiction of a meeting between the famous 4th century Egyptian Coptic monks and desert fathers, St. Antony of Egypt and St. Paul of Thebes. In both panels, the figures stand facing each other, each holding a crozier with a medieval Irish symbol, which is a medieval Irish symbol of spiritual authority that we'd see associated typically with bishops or abbots. A circular loaf of bread appears between the 2 monks. On the left panel, which is the certain identification of Paul and Antony, the raven is seen in flight holding the bread between the monks. If the panel on the right is Paul and Antony as well, then the bird on the bottom right represents the raven, but this time on the ground. So the question arises, what is the origin of this scene and what meaning did it have for the early insular communities who so frequently included it on their stone sculptures? I want to turn now to present-day Scotland and the village of Ruthwell, indicated on the map here. In the late 8th century, this area was part of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. Inside the church at Ruthwell, we have one of the most well-known Anglo-Saxon monuments called the Ruthwell Cross, which dates to the 8th century. The cross stands tall at nearly 5.5 meters, or for the among us, that's nearly 18 feet tall, and epitomizes one of the finest and earliest examples of early insular art. A lot has been written about the Ruthwell Cross and the figurative relief carvings and inscriptions found on it, and for very good reason. It is an incredibly rich work of art. Importantly for us this evening, the Ruthwell Cross's Latin inscription identifying the scenes on the cross are also unique in early medieval insular stone sculpture. On this slide, I have labeled the panels. As you can see, the scenes on the cross derive overwhelmingly from the life of Christ, which is not surprising considering it's a Christian monument in the shape of a cross. What may be altogether more surprising is that of the panels I've labeled here, one clearly has its origin with both a scene and with figures that are from outside the Bible. On the north face of the cross, in the panel here, we see two of the great Egyptian desert fathers, Antony of Egypt and Paul of Thebes. This scene might have gone unidentified, except that quite mercifully, there is an inscription surrounding the panel, which I've provided the transcription and translation of on the slide. It says Sanctus Paulus et Antonius fregerunt panem in deserto, which translated as St. Paul and Antony broke bread in the desert. This inscription is a direct quote from Jerome's 4th century Life of Paul, a famous late antique biography. And this panel on the Ruthwell Cross represents the first time this scene is found in Britain or Ireland. Though these two Egyptian saints are first found here, the inclusion of these two great monastic fathers will become a regular scene found on the stone slabs and high crosses in the coming century. Ruthwell is a bit of a trend-setting cross in that regard. Now, the language of breaking bread here is overwhelmingly used in the Bible for communion, which is why many insular communities may have attached a Eucharistic significance to this scene. Now, before we look more in depth at this panel of the two great Egyptian saints, I'm aware that many of you all may have never heard of either of these saints. So I first want to acquaint you with the characters and the story behind this scene to provide some context. So we're going to start with Antony of Egypt, one of the most famous late antique saints, and one of the most frequent figures we see on medieval insular stone crosses. Antony was considered to be one of the fathers of monasticism, and his call to the ascetic life is one of the most well-known from late antiquity, thanks to a widely read biography written by the man pictured, the Bishop of Alexandria, named Athanasius. His book, called The Life of Antony, was a late antique bestseller and was translated from its original Greek into Latin very soon after Athanasius wrote it. This allowed for Antony's story to be known to a much wider audience in Europe from a relatively early period. In The Life of Antony, Athanasius recounts the life of a humble, illiterate Egyptian youth, whose life in the desert was marked by brutal, nearly fatal fights with demons, as pictured here, but also with regular, ecstatic, intimate encounters with God. When Antony was around 18 to 20 years old, he sold his possessions and retreated into the Egyptian desert, where he was to live the rest of his life, mostly in solitude, prayer, and fasting in preparation for heaven. His life inspired countless Christians for over a millennia to seek God through the monastic life. I want to turn our attention now to the second Egyptian desert father who appears regularly in Irish art and literature. St. Paul of Thebes, or St. Paul the Hermit as he is sometimes called, was born in Egypt sometime around 227 AD. He lived at the same time as Antony, but was a few decades older. Paul lived during the time of the Emperor Decius's persecution of Christians in the year 250. It was during this period that Paul of Thebes fled into the desert to escape persecution. He was never to return to regular society. Paul retreated further and further into the desert until at last he came to a rocky mountain with a cave which had been used as a mint in the days of Antony and Cleopatra's affair. Paul was to spend the rest of his life in this isolated cave in prayer and solitude. This map shows the location of Antony and Paul's caves, which are relatively close together in the eastern desert of Egypt, near the Red Sea. Their close proximity allowed for a meeting between these two great saints. At the age of 113 years old, Paul was still living in his small cave when the 90-year-old Antony, after being told in a dream that Paul was a far more perfect monk than he was, decided to pay Paul a visit. He undertook a harrowing journey through the desert where he braved a range of mythological creatures, including centaurs, which are represented here. When Antony finally arrived at Paul's cave, after a rather chilly reception initially by Paul, the two monks embraced, and as they talked, a raven placed a whole loaf of bread in front of them. Paul remarked that for the past 60 years, the raven brought him half a loaf of bread daily, but today, God had provided double his daily ration to accommodate Antony. However, a dispute broke out between the two monks over who should have the honor of breaking the loaf in two, each wanting the other to have the honor of breaking the bread. Finally, they decided that they would each hold part of the bread and pull at the same time, and they enjoyed their meal in Christian unity and peace. The image of Paul and Antony, while first seen on the Ruthwell Cross in Scotland, becomes a regular part of the iconographical programs of stone monuments on both sides of the Irish Sea. I've given two examples on this slide from one monastic site alone, the famous community in Ireland of Kells. The two fully completed high crosses at Kells both show depictions of Paul and Antony's meeting in the desert, but there are some clear differences in composition. First, the Irish panels that show Paul and Antony include the raven flying down from heaven between the two saints' heads, whereas the Ruthwell Cross's depiction of their meeting excluded the raven. Further, the Irish depiction at Kells do not show any particular interest in making these two Egyptian saints look Egyptian. Rather, they seem to be represented as more Irish in flavor, in their holding of their croziers, and in the case of the panel on the right, the saint that we see on the far right seems to have a book bag at his side, which would be typical of an Irish holy figure. Now, in looking at their clothes, we can see their clothes here. These tunics are much more Irish in the way they look. And this is different than what we see, for instance, returning back to Scotland, when we look at Phallus Wester, which also features Paul and Antony. In neither scene on the Kells crosses do we have an attempt to recreate Paul's clothes, which Jerome tells us consist of a tunic woven out of palm leaves like a wicker basket. On the left side of this slide, we can see such an attempt made by our artist to show the texture of his woven clothes on the Phallus Wester stone. The artist's effort is comparable to later depictions of Paul at St. Antony's Monastery in Egypt, which shows him wearing a cross-hatched tunic, as we see in the second picture from the left on the slide. This Phallus Wester artist also attempts to recreate Paul's cave with the palm trees, and we see no such attempt to recreate his surroundings at Kells. The Irish artists seem keen to make these Egyptian saints more Irish, while the artist at Phallus Wester does try to preserve some measure of authenticity of Paul's Egyptian clothing and environment. Now, art historians are divided on the number of monuments which show one or both of these great Egyptian saints. In a conservative estimation, there are at least 11 confirmed and 3 possible panels featuring one or both saints in Ireland alone. In Scotland, in addition to the Ruthwell Cross, we have 2 confirmed Pictish cross slabs and 3 more possible identifications of the saints elsewhere in Scotland. These images of Paul and Antony are found throughout present-day Scotland and Ireland, but there does seem to be a higher number of them in areas with considerable influences from the monasteries associated with the Irish saint and missionary to Scotland, St. Columba, who founded the Hebridean Monastery of Iona. This is the first image we have of Columba in the manuscript tradition on the slide here. Now we can see the Egyptian saints on both of the complete, still intact crosses at Kells. In fact, we have certain panels and two certain panels and one possible panel of the two on crosses, which is quite remarkable considering the crosses are, as most Irish high crosses of this period are, overwhelmingly biblical in their imagery otherwise. The scene on the left and the one in the middle show Paul and Antony's desert meal, whereas the scene on the right may show Antony in the center with demons on either side, whispering into his ears to tempt him. Though the identification of Antony with the demons is a matter of some dispute. We also find Antony and Paul on the 10th century highly stylized moon cross, where they are seen in the middle image, seated, facing each other, holding between them a raven, or holding bread between them with a raven flying down above them. In the image on the bottom left, we once again see potentially Antony flanked by two beasts who may be trying to lead him astray. So what I've attempted to provide here is an impressionistic overview of some of the key places we see the popular Coptic saints featured in early British and Irish art, where they appear regularly and prominently far removed in time and space from the late antique Egyptian deserts where their stories originate. The movement that made Antony popular, or that Antony made popular, I should say, extended into Europe well into the Middle Ages. But it's revealing that before the year 1000, Britain and Ireland had by far the most artistic representations of these two saints in stone sculpture compared to the rest of Europe. So in closing this evening, I want to consider very briefly one of the major reasons why I believe we see early insular monastic communities attach themselves so strongly to these Egyptian monastic pioneers. When the art of the high crosses is overwhelmingly derived from the Bible, and when the scenes we see from these two saints' lives could easily be represented with scenes from the Bible, which would fit in better with the overall biblical theme of the crosses, why do insular artists continually turn to Egypt for their images? I think the key here is to look carefully at the literature contemporary with the crosses to see if they provide some insight. The Middle Irish Life of Columba offers us a clue in its beautiful homiletic introduction to Columba's life. The author places Columba in the tradition of three fathers: the biblical patriarch Abraham, whom Christians consider to be their spiritual father, as well as the Egyptian saints Antony and Paul. In the excerpt I've included on this slide, the Irish author says, "Now in three ways are men summoned to the knowledge of the Lord and to the membership of his family. This is the first way, the urging and kindling of men by the divine grace to serve the Lord after the example of Paul and of Anthony, the monk, and the other faithful monks who used to serve God there in Egypt." Following in Abraham's footsteps, the author tells us Paul and Antony and the other Egyptian desert fathers joined that same spiritual family as Abraham. Abraham, Paul, and Antony are held up to be the best examples of how to become part of God's family. And our Columban author makes clear in his introduction that Columba is following in these very same footsteps of these three fathers of the faith. The stories of Antony and Paul in Ireland, as elsewhere, provided insular monks with both an illustrious spiritual family to which they belong and an origin story for their way of life. The 8th century Irish canon law collection called the Hibernensis, for instance, in a section entitled Concerning the Beginnings and Authority of Monks, called Paul and Antony fathers, exemplars, and most noble progenitors of the monastic way of life. Paul and Antony were an important part of medieval monastic identity, especially within the Columban communities in Ireland and in present-day Scotland. In seeing Paul and Antony as the origin for their way of life, the medieval Irish monks were following in the footsteps of several well-known patristic authors. Jerome, who was the author of the life of Paul, wrote in his letter to Eustochium that Paul was the originator of this way of life, but Antony made it famous. And then Cassian, an author very influential in medieval Ireland and Britain, wrote the originators of monasticism were those whom we mentioned just now, Saints Paul and Antony. The frequency that we see Paul and Antony on the stone sculptures of Scotland and Ireland speaks to the importance of Egyptian monasticism in the lives of medieval monastic communities, and in particular to the formation and articulation of their identity and who they understood themselves to be. By showing themselves a spiritual lineage that traced its origin back to the great Egyptian saints, Paul and Antony, who they saw as their spiritual fathers, the insular monks from Britain and Ireland were inserting themselves into a universal family that was bound by belief and not by blood, with deep roots in the Egyptian deserts. So much so that the great 8th century Northumbrian scholar Alcuin called the Irish monks Egyptian children. And I do have a hard time believing that that designation would have made would certainly have made these Egyptian or these Irish monks very proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, everyone. So we're going to have a little time for questions now. There is a question and answer option at the bottom of your screens in Zoom. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in there. And whilst people find that, which was new to me as well, maybe I can take chair's prerogative and ask Meredith the first question. So I was wondering, given these connections between Egypt and Ireland, what's the process of transmission that allows the British and Irish communities to see or interact with Egyptian sources?
So it looks like, so the easier one to look at is the Coptic one with Paul and Antony. And that is certainly through monastic networks. So we know that, for instance, British and Irish monasticism, and Britain and Ireland in particular, in general, were still closely connected to the continent in the 6th centuries and beyond. The digs at Tintagel, for instance, the recent excavations 2017 show quite a lot of interaction between not just Gaul or modern day kind of France area, but also North Africa and farther east, with all of these types of material cultures coming into Britain, far Western Britain. So we know there's quite an active transmission back and forth between Britain, Ireland, and the continent. So when we see like Paul and Antony, for instance, the fact that they quote from Jerome on the Ruthwell cross tells us that they actually probably had maybe the full text, but if not the full text, they certainly had part of the text. So having, the transfer, the removal of moving of manuscripts, of books, of scrolls, things like that, from the continent onto British and Irish soil, certainly very, very common. As I mentioned earlier as well, with regards to the much tougher element of Egyptian influence to prove, which is the pharaonic influence, the main ones going there would be archaeological. So first of all, Book of the Dead, those were preserved on usually papyrus, and those are quite easily moved. So that would be one way. But another way is the statues of Osiris that have been found in Gaul, possibly. But they've been found in Britain, but what the context was, meaning what date they were placed there, is uncertain. But we know that there was some type of cult of Isis, who's the wife of Osiris, in Gaul, into late antiquity. So the movement of people, movement of ideas, movement of goods was still very much happening in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries and beyond, with lots of contacts between Britain and Irish churches, and especially the churches in Gaul and North Africa. So when we're looking at transmission, probably largely literary, but also we could also have figurines and things like that.
Meredith. As a librarian, I'm always gratified to hear it's partly to do with manuscripts and textual transmission. We are getting some questions in the question and answer box. I've got 6 so far, so if I just read them out for everyone to hear, Meredith, I'm afraid I'm going to leave you to answer them, of course. So the first is from Roland Enmarch, and he asks whether there's any evidence for Coptic Christians actually visiting or migrating to Ireland in this time period?
That is a terrific question. And That depends on how you interpret. So there's this really cryptic line in one of the litanies of saints from Ireland that's talks about the death, or talks about the burial of seven Egyptian monks. So the debate around these seven Egyptian monks, and these would be early medieval. This was an early medieval text talking about the presence of these seven Egyptian monks who had been buried in Ireland. So the question is, were these Coptic monks that had moved to Ireland, which is one interpretation of it, or are these monks who perhaps were considered Egyptian by virtue of their way of life? So much like that last quote that we have up here by Aquin, where the Irish monks were often called, Egyptian because they were so similar in their ascetic practices and so forth. So maybe these were particularly ascetic monks. So unfortunately, that line has attracted quite a lot of attention, just because it would be fascinating to know that there were actually, for sure, presence of these Coptic monks in Ireland in the early medieval period, but unfortunately, we just don't know. Michelle Brown has written a really great chapter called "The Eastwardness of Things," and in it she kind of reviews the evidence of potential presence of Irish or of Egyptians and Syrian and people kind of from the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, in Britain and Ireland, and the way that maybe comes across in some of the artwork. It's definitely worth saying. Her article is called "The Eastwardness of Things," and it's certainly worth looking. So the quick short answer is possibly they were there. There are a couple of cryptic references, just like the martyrology I was just mentioning, but nothing for certain, unfortunately, at this point.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm going to jump to our third question. The second one is again about how the depictions travel from Egypt to Ireland. So possibly covered that, and I know we have limited time. So this is from Neville Kirk-Smith, and he asks, was the Coptic cross much later? The shape is different.
So the Coptic cross, that the textile that I provided that produced Walter Horan's theory that perhaps instead of looking at a Roman origin for the insular ringed cross, we may be looking at a Coptic origin for that. Actually, that textile, I believe, is from the 5th century. It's earlier than the insular crosses by at least a century, and it's on a very portable medium. So textiles, of course, are very portable. So yes, the Coptic ringed cross predates the insular ringed crosses by at least 100 years.
Thanks.
Or at least I should say the freestanding insular crosses. So the Irish and British crosses were also inscribed before that. And we also have wooden crosses, which we obviously don't have any remaining of those. So
our next question comes from Lindsay, who asks whether the carvers of the crosses, are they tailoring their choices of motif to the beliefs of their pagan listeners in any way?
Right. So there's a lot of discussion about the role of the artist and the role of the patrons and how these are interacting. So there are a few what seem to be pagan images on some of these crosses. So for instance, I'm more familiar with the Irish high crosses, so I'll stay with my area of more familiarity. So we sometimes see, for instance, like what look like zodiac signs, or we'll see pagan creatures like centaurs or kind of mythical type beasts. So there do seem to be some non-Christian, I don't want to necessarily call them pagan, but explicitly non-Christian images, motifs, and so forth on the crosses. How much free reign the artist had is not certain, because we really don't have the processes, preserved for us. So, I'm sure there was some type of conversation between the artist and the patron and the community as to what exactly they wanted. But there was at least enough artist prerogative that, like Roger Staley's most recent book talks about Meredith's, the Meredith master, who Meredith's the one, Murdoch cross was done by Murdoch master. So were presumably both of the crosses at Kells. So there were enough similarities, even though we were looking at probably, we're looking at two different monasteries. There were enough similarities in artistic style, and that we can say this is from the same artist. But in terms of pagan imagery, paganism is kind of a fraught question at this point because paganism had not really been in these countries for paganism as we think about them had been long um, disenfranchised, I would say, in terms by the time the high crosses that we see today are being erected.
Thanks, Meredith. So our next question is from Ian Campbell, and actually I think it's related to that earlier one, and you've almost answered it. So Ian asked whether, can you say anything about Egyptian monks reaching Scotland and Ireland? So I believe there is one reference to 7 Egyptians in Ireland, which I think
that's it. Yeah.
So yes, Ian is already ahead of us there, and I hadn't got down to the bottom of the questions. So he also notes St. Macar or Macarius of Aberdeen, who might be said to have been Egyptian in 15th century hagiographical sources. So.
Yeah, and if I were to give a more full talk, actually, we know that Egyptian monks were influential in more than just the art of the high crosses as well. So, like when we're looking at Coptic influence, my specialty is penitentials. So I look a lot at Irish and British penance, and they, especially the Irish penitentials, draw quite a lot from Eastern sources. We do actually see some Egyptian desert fathers mentioned by name in the Irish penitentials that date to the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. So there is quite a lot of transmission. Macarius is one of the ones that they actually do name, one of the great desert fathers who was in the area between Alexandria and Cairo today. His monastery was in Upper Egypt. So there were, but in terms of Irish monks, or excuse me, Egyptian monks in these areas, I don't find it implausible. I mean, I just keep thinking about the Archbishop Theodore, the Archbishop of Canterbury, coming from the East at a very early period. You know, we know that there was a movement of people among the monastic and clerical circles from the East into the insular world. And so it's not beyond to me the realm of possibility to have Egyptian monks coming to Ireland and to Britain.
Thank you. I'm going to take the final 2 questions that I can see here. So the penultimate one is from William Atkinson. He asks, regarding the relationships between the stonework on Meredith's cross and the pharaonic motifs or images, could you explain why the Irish church adopted the style of inscription of the Egyptians?
So that's why they adopted certain things is always a fraught territory, because you're then kind of projecting yourself into the minds of people who lived over 1,000 years ago. But it's very common in art history for art historians to look at the transmission of styles, of motifs, of compositions, to look at potential cross-cultural connections, right? So for instance, while we see the scales first appear seemingly in a Western context, in a Christian Western context in Ireland, we see them coming to the continent not too long thereafter in some of the Last Judgment scenes, as I showed you. So the reason why they may have chosen pharaonic motifs, who's to say? They could have, I mean, I'm not 100% certain that they are pharaonic. I just want to say that. What I was trying to do there was to show you some of the art historical debates surrounding potential pharaonic influence on the high crosses. So they could, it's very common for them to appropriate non-Christian motifs into Christian context. So we see, for instance, Osiris. He's obviously an imposing figure in the Book of the Dead images that I showed with his V figure. He's much larger. He's overseeing this judgment scene. So whether it's Christian or not in its origin doesn't matter. What they can do is put Jesus there, make it Archangel Michael instead of Anubis, and there we've got a Christian scene. So when we talk about borrowing this, it wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have seen this as, you know, it wouldn't have been an issue for them that it was pagan, for instance.
So this is the last question I'm going to read out tonight, given the time. And this sort of changes the direction a little bit. So it's from an anonymous attendee who asks, when the Irish missionaries traveled to the continent, did they bring the high crosses and their Egyptian influences there with them? So do we see this moving out of Ireland, I guess?
So the Irish Peregrini, who is what you're talking about, the exiles and the pilgrims and the scholars who traveled from Ireland. They were very, very well known. They were very influential. They established a number of monastic communities throughout Gaul, northern Italy. Columbanus is the most famous one, I would say, at least at the early period. But then we have later ones like Dequil and so forth. So bringing the Irish motifs, I'm not sure they would have needed to, because when we look especially at southern Gaul, so particularly the Abbey of Lorenz, that monastery was a powerhouse of what we would consider like Eastern monasticism. So Cassian, the church father that I had mentioned just a moment ago, he actually trained for 10 years under the Egyptian Desert Fathers and then moved to Gaul and established 2 monasteries. The founder of Lorenz had also had extensive Coptic training. So Gaul actually, especially Southern Gaul, I should clarify, actually had already kind of a robust Coptic flavor to it in the 5th, 6th century when the Gallic leaders were going to down to Egypt for training. So there would already have been some receptivity to this type of monasticism. And in fact, when we look in the penitentials, when we look at Irish monasticism, it's very often, almost to a point of cliche, noting how Egyptian it is. What we're actually looking at is Egyptian influence mediated through primarily Latin sources, and particularly Cassian was a big one. So Cassian wrote 2 very influential books based upon his time in the Egyptian desert. One is called The Conferences and the other is called The Institutes. And both of them explain how monks can basically adapt the Egyptian desert life to their own context. So Gaul, Ireland, Britain. And these books are quoted quite a lot. They're quoted in some of the earliest insular Christian sources. So there was it was more like, Gaul was the medium through which Egyptian monasticism was coming to Ireland and Britain. And so they would have already had kind of a robust tradition before the Irish even started peregrinating en masse in the 8th, 9th centuries and beyond. So there's probably some cross-cultural influence, but a lot of the Egyptian influence we see actually was coming from Gaul itself.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you for handling all those questions. Amazing extra bits to the talk tonight. I'm sorry if I didn't get your question. I'm sure, Meredith, we'll be able to see it in the question and answer tab as we look at this afterwards. So thank you again, Meredith, and thank you to everyone online for attending. The next lecture in this series will take place in the new year on the 23rd of February, when Professor David Steinsaltz will talk to us on aging. What is it? Why is it? And where is it going? That's it for now, I'm afraid. So I hope you all have a great holiday season, and I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Bye.